Goeiedag en hartlik welkom by Reguit met Robinson of Lidnet. Ons spesiale gas is Bonang Mohale, wat onlangs aangewys is as die president van Business Unity South Africa, BUSA. Hy is met ander woorde die stem van die privaat sektor in die land. Hy het al verskeie hoë poste in groot internasionale maatskappye beklee, soos hoof van Royal Dutch Shell in Suid-Afrika. Daarbey is hy deesdae 'n professor ook en kanselier van die Universiteit van die Vrystaat. Hy is 'n man wat sy sê kan sê en hy skroom nie om die regering aan te vat as hy dink dis nodig nie. Welcome, Mr. Mohale. It's nice talking to you again. What are your goals that you've set for yourself in the next 3 years?
Freek Robinson, baie dankie vir alles. Ek waardeer dit.
Great pleasure.
So, BUSA is really the apex organization of other organizations. To give you an idea, Business Leadership South Africa has about 89 CEOs of the 100 listed companies on the JSE. It's one member out of the 55 that are members of BUSA. All the mines used to belong to the old Chamber of Mines, now called the Minerals Council. It's a second member. The third and final member I'll talk about in the interest of time is all the banks belong to the Banking Association of Southern Africa, BUSA, is the third member. So being the voice of business, being the only representative in NEDLAC, together with other 3 social partners, sitting in at the International Labour Organization on the European employer bodies, the same with the African Union. For instance, we want to use this voice loudly but judiciously. We want to be honest, open, and transparent in our conversations with government because politics determines economics. We want to forcefully insert ourselves because where the party ends is the beginning of both state and government. And sometimes we use these things interchangeably. And clearly, this ANC-led government does not know the difference between a state broadcaster and a public broadcaster. They don't know the difference between party and state. They don't understand that when you are the president of the country, you take an oath of office to be the president of the state and the country, to act in the best interest of South Africa, Inc., to uphold, to respect, and protect the Constitution. But we have heard some presidents say, no, but I put the party before the state, which is against the law, because you just put your right hand on the Bible, if you are that way inclined, and sworn allegiance to the Constitution of the land as the supreme document that governs how we function. So to be absolutely clear about that role, clarity, and definition, we are going to be direct, we are going to be crisp, clear, concise, and precise, respectful, but robust. Because if we are not, we are actually at the precipice, at the tipping point. So before we tilt over, we normally pull back. Freek.
You've described now how you're going to do things, but what are you going to do? What do you really want to achieve? For instance, I can refer you to Mr. Sipho Pichana, your predecessor, who actually told you and others when he left that there are some unfinished business. For instance, you submitted a report to the president, a strategy in July last year. What happened to that since?
So the 3 things that we want to achieve is the 3 things that we have always communicated to government. One is we are going to demand from this ANC-led government ethical leadership. Number 2, absolute transparency. Number 3, this notion of final accountability. The 3 pillars on which we are going to base this will be this notion of an inclusive socio-economic growth and transformation. Secondly, it's about the protection of key state institutions, especially the Chapter 9 institutions. Lastly, it's about ensuring that business is a national asset. Because when business does well, society generally does well. How are we going to do that? We are going to do that as BUSA, number one, to be a trusted advisor, a partner of choice, and we are going to do everything possible in our power to make sure that this ANC-led government becomes a capable state. Because in the last 27 years, we have learned that it's better to deal with a capable state than that which is not. Freek?
You've named a number of things. First of all, is growth, because we all know if we don't have growth in the economy, then we're not going to solve the problem of unemployment. So what specifically do you foresee can you realistically do in practice to actually kickstart growth in South Africa?
So when you talk to our labor counterparts, our partners at Network, number one, they'll say, help us create jobs. Number two, they will say, transform so that this economy looks like us and is broadly reflective of the demographics. Number three, growth. But in business, we know that the first two cannot be realistically achieved in great numbers unless there's growth. If you don't have growth, very soon you'll be talking about the redistribution of poverty, not the redistribution of wealth. So in our conversation with business, we are saying, actually, when we create jobs, it's not in and of itself, but we are creating markets of the future. Because there's a problem when your own employees cannot afford the goods and services that you provide. Number two, we are going to say we need to continue to provide growth, and by focusing on 4 sectors that have already been identified and discussed with the president from this plan that we talk about, drawn up by BUSA and BBC, we put a new name to it, Business for South Africa, where number one, we said business thrives when there's regulatory certainty and policy stability. And in that plan, we said we are going to help give effect to the 4 foremost overarching priorities that the president in his 5th State of the Nation address articulated to us. Number one, he said we need to defeat this coronavirus pandemic. Number two, he said we needed to accelerate our growth. This is the growth that you and I are talking about. Number three, he said we must implement the structural reforms that we've been talking about for the last 10 years. And then lastly, let's root out corruption and deliver a capable state. So there's high degree of alignment. From our own economic recovery plan, we are going to distill and synthesize 3, no more than 4 things that we want to put on the table and roll our sleeves and say, we are going to be reliable partners with you, government, in rolling out infrastructure, in attracting investment, but in making sure that we do the basics like planned and preventative maintenance. Because where we are, we celebrated with one eye and cried with another when Stats SA released the GDP figures 2 weeks ago to say we have now grown positive GDP growth of 1.2%. There's a problem with that because one, the population growth is 1.6%. The second problem is that if you assume that interest rates are, say, 6% and CPI is 3%, then it stands to reason that the GDP must grow by 3% if you are not going to stand still or go backwards. At the moment, 1.2% positive GDP growth is actually taking us backwards, which means that disposable income and discretionary purchasing power of Freek Robinson and Bonang Mohale actually going backwards. We are not going anywhere fast. But also it's a jobless growth because we have lost more than 1 million jobs just in the pandemic when you do the math. And then lastly, we are growing in those areas where you're not creating outsized and oversized job impact. You are growing in this broad category that for now we'll call financial services, but not in mining, not in manufacturing, not in agriculture, not even in information communication and technology, not in tourism and hospitality, where we hire women in large numbers. So I think moving forward, we need to ensure that we create an environment where our rating agencies will find it easy to work with us and restore us to an investment grade, not 3 notches below where we are at the moment. Because when we are below investment grade, the cost of borrowing for government and for business and for you just goes higher, even for the same amount of debt, Freek.
You have, with the government, actually instituted the Employment Council. What happened to that?
A lot of things that we have started are just ticking along. Typical of South Africans. Now we are talking with government about the infrastructure team and that the National Infrastructure Program 2050. We have done investment summits, we have done job summits, and all those are wonderful plans. But I think in the final analysis, it's like putting Band-Aid on a wound. It's not dealing with the root cause of the problem. Our root cause of the problem is that we have the lowest levels of confidence, trust, and hope since the Second World War. In exactly the same way that what drives share prices in the private companies is rumor and speculation. We need to send a strategic message that says all the 4 social partners are aligned, have diagnosed the problem, and are moving in the same direction, and we have a common understanding of what our problems is. Number 1, I think we need to take the top state capture miscreants to jail, because people can't steal 1.5 trillion South African rands in 5 years and get away with it. They can't continue to siphon off 200 billion a year every year to the 2 Zupta families. And by the way, state capture hasn't stopped. It's still continuing even in PPEs. Secondly, I think we need to reduce government debt because it's unaffordable. We need to reduce the public sector wage bill because it now consumes 70% of what Edward Kieswetter collects from South African Revenue Service, being public sector wage bill, social security, and just servicing of debt. But also we need to fix the more than 740 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies. Lastly, I think we need to take seriously this job of education, because that's how we create the pipeline of young people, 150,000 graduates that get onto the job market, often with inappropriate skills. Grow our own team, focus on vocational training, because 27 years into democracy, we've only managed to increase people who go to universities from 7 to 11%. But not everybody needs to be a professor. Not everybody needs to be a doctor or a lawyer. Germany is Europe's #1 economy because they teach them artisanal skills, fitting, turning, millwrights, electrician, but also just car mechanics. That's why they make the best cars in the world. Freek?
Together with government and President Ramaphosa in particular, you have actually set yourself some goals for the investment in the country to kickstart the economy. Obviously, the pandemic has now ruined many of those plans, but what do you believe is the situation today? Can you really get people overseas, given the situation in our economy, that they will be eager to come to South Africa and invest here? And what about private sector here in South Africa itself, investing in the country?
The pandemic has taken us back quite a while because we wanted to raise $100 billion US, but we have always been clear that it needs to be front-ended by domestic direct investment. Then foreign direct investment will happen. Secondly, we have always been clear that the people who are investors don't necessarily talk to governments. They talk to other companies, private companies. They talk about projects. They invest in dams, in bridges, in the building of new infrastructure, like they did in 2010 when we spent 787 billion South African rands in building and renovating the 10th stadium, and we did it in record time. But when the pandemic hit us, I think all of us need to accept that we had already scored a number of own goals, cut our own nose to spite our own face, and self-inflicted wounds. Number 1, of course, we are just putting our arms around state capture. Number 2, we were already in a recession. Number 3, Moody's had downgraded us, even though they resisted up until the last moment to downgrade us, joining Fitch and Standard & Poor's, but we didn't even see the opportunity that they were giving us. So by the time the pandemic found us, we were face down, prostrate, and absolutely finished. Now we add the fifth layer, the 2 weeks in July, where we went on rampant looting of an industrial scale, taking this country probably back another 20 years. With that action and that action alone, the third quarter figures, when they come in, they'll reflect three numbers that are not in these numbers as we speak. Number one, the looting that took out 50 billion and wiped up an entire percentage points from our GDP. Number two, they exclude the Transnet cyber attack that lasted longer than the 2 weeks of looting. Thirdly, it's how we fix our major supply chain to be able to get the goods where they are needed, to be able to benefit from this commodities super cycle. For instance, the Durban port was rated the third from the bottom before the looting. Those are the systemic and systematic things that we need to fix. And I think that's where business can roll its sleeves and say, the best run ports in the world, like the one in Singapore, by the way, that is run by Zamalek, is actually run by the private sector. The colleague of mine who I used to work with in Shell Oil Products Africa, he's running that port. When you go to Harvard, it's one of the 3 Harvard classics that most MBA students are being taught. I think we don't have to reinvent anything. We need to look at countries like Singapore, like Paul Kagame did in Rwanda, and focus just on a few things. In Singapore, they focused on meritocracy, on pragmatism, and honesty. In China, 2010, they were on to their 12th 5-year plan. So for 6 years, they've been driving 2 things and 2 things only: energy security and personal security. In South Africa, in that period of time, 27 years, I can count no less than 6 economic plans, including the NDP 2030, the New Growth Path, the RDP as BUSA, Growth, Employment and Redistribution Strategy. And now we are on Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. And yet our weakest link is actually doing the execution. I think it was General George Patton who said, great wars are won by good execution, not great plans, because good execution will save even a mediocre plan. Freek?
I believe we've made some serious mistakes at the beginning of this pandemic. But do you believe that we have basically sorted out this situation now and that we can start moving forward?
We see some green shoots of fixing the problems and the mistakes that we made. But the cold facts tell us that we are far from being out of the woods. So when the president set us a herd immunity target of 67% in January, you did the math, that's 42 million people. Out of, round off the figure, 60 million South Africans. That's an entire adult population. It means we ought to have been inoculating at the rate of 100,000 a day every day. If we had done that, it would have taken us 400 days or 13.3 months, which means we were agitating and orchestrating to finish only in 2022. But by the time March came, or by the way, the then Minister of Health also set us another target of inoculating 1.2 million frontline workers by the end of March. When you took the tally on the 27th of March, and you compare ourselves with our BRICS counterparts, Brazil was already on 579,000, Russia 800,000, India 2 million, China 15 million, South Africa 0. So our actions must demonstrate that we started late, we were behind, therefore we must double up. But up until today, we are still not routinely vaccinating on Saturdays and Sundays in the public sector. The private sector is doing. We are still not reaching our target of 400,000 vaccinations a day, every day, even though we've got capacity to do so. Because government claims we can't pay people overtime, we don't have money. And yet healthcare workers work in hospitals Saturdays and Sundays. It's just how they are rostered. It's a management thing. It's a supervisory issue. Healthcare workers don't need to be paid extra for working on Saturdays and Sundays. So I think where we are now, we understand as business that the vaccine rollout was always going to be a race, because the country that can say we've defeated the pandemic first will then be able to reap the pent-up global tourism demand. Tourism matters to us because it's almost 10% of our GDP. 10.2 million people visited pre-COVID. Now it's less than 3 million and going down. The percentage is 7% and going down. But also, even when you compare ourselves with African countries, 22 countries are ahead of us in terms of percentage of people that are fully vaccinated. Now, 22 countries have opened up to people that are fully vaccinated. 11 countries have vaccinated more than 100% of their own population. I think there are lots of learnings. So we wanted to do two things. We should have done three things with the pandemic: save lives, lock down, make sure that the hospitals are ready, the oxygen masks, and we convert some public amenities into hospitals. Secondly, preserve livelihoods, because we knew that we were going to kill 10 times more people from hunger and starvation, having lost their jobs, than those who would have been killed by the pandemic. What we should have emphasized is that for the real peace of mind is how we break the link between coronavirus pandemic cases and deaths. And the only way you do that is through vaccinations, because the people that are vaccinated are reducing their chances of being infected. If they are, it reduces the severity, which means they don't need severe hospitalizations and they don't need oxygen. And if they do get the virus, they are unlikely to die from it. 99.8% of all the deaths in the world today are emanating from people who are unvaccinated. So the case for vaccination is strong, it's compelling. We need to be led by science, not by ideology and politics free.
There's a saying that if you're in a hole, stop digging. There's no question about it. We are in a hole. What would you say should we stop doing?
Two things. One, we should stop cadre deployment, because that's what led us to where we are now. It's just a bad policy. You see, if the ANC was putting their best cadres to run SAA, their best cadres to run ESCOM, we wouldn't have a problem with it. But they are giving us absolutely the worst, like they did with the weekend special. They gave us Des Van Rooyen. We're getting rid of really good quality people. That's number one. Number two, we need to stop state capture, because it doesn't matter what we do. The amount that is stolen, we won't be able to make productively in 10 years. Like I said, I mean, the SACC has a report that says we're talking about 70 billion. The Zondo Commission can trace directly into people's accounts 57 billion. But the work that we did as business, we know that in 5 years, it's 1.5 trillion. For the last 9 wasted years, that's 200 billion a year every year. That's another 2 trillion rand over a period of 10 years. So if we stop state capture and we stop cadre deployment, I think we'll be on our way. Here's a useless piece of math. There's more than 740 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies. Had we put in women and Black people as CEOs of these 740 SOEs in 27 years, and we allowed them to serve one term of 5 years without any political interference, like we did at Telkom with Sipho Maseko as the CEO and Dr. Jabulani Albert Mabuza as the chairperson, with 20% of them having failed, today would have 3,000 women and men with a demonstrable track record of running some of our state-owned enterprises, some of whom which are bigger than some African economies. So that when Kenya Airways and Ethiopian Airways is looking for the CEO, they look south to this 84-year award-winning African airline. But the pride and joy of this country, SAA, is yet to be relaunched. Freek?
Well, I just quickly want to put a few philosophies to you. The first one is on the whole question of land. You know, this is a discussion in politics whether ownership should be taken away and then the state should own everything. You yourself, do you believe in that kind of ideology, or that we must change or shift from where we are at the moment in terms of the fundamental position and importance of land ownership?
You see, there is no possession greater than land, because land is the first means of production. Land allows communities to be able to do stuff. So when we speak about land expropriation without compensation, let's accept as South Africans that in 1913, it was the 10th land expropriation without compensation directed against African people. But our constitution is adequate. It does not need any amendment whatsoever. Because in our current constitution, Section 25, Article 3A, talks about land reform, especially in that section that speaks about security of tenure. And there are three things. One, it talks about land restitution. Two, land redistribution. Lastly, it talks about land tenure, especially because women account for 80% of the production of the land, and yet they own less than 1% of the land. That's what they're trying to address. And when you look at the 8th line from the bottom on Section 25, Article 3A, it says, when conditions of fair and equitable have been adequately fulfilled in the public interest, then compensation can be down to zero. There's your zero compensation. Land expropriation without compensation is there. I think here it's a failure of deriving the requisite regulations, not the adequacy of the act of the constitution. But also, when you look at it historically, of all the 400 MPs of Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela's first cabinet, 27th of April 1984, the least resourced, the one that has no permanent land judge, was the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries. Up until today, we haven't changed that. So I think it's an error of omission rather than an error of commission. Lastly, I think on land, we know that even when we amend the constitution, we have done many amendments and the sky has not fallen over because we are going to do it in a constitutionally responsible manner. This is not the Brazilian or the Zimbabwean land grab. We do it because if we don't, then those that are left of left are going to use it, and before we know it, there's going to be anarchy. Rather, we do it ourselves. That's why business supports it. Lastly, in fact, if you are a landowner in Stellenbosch, you are probably fifth in line to worry about land expropriation without compensation. Because number one, we're saying to government, there's 3.5 million people in Soweto. Officially, they say 2 million. It's still bigger than the population of Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Eswatini. So Soweto is bigger than countries. These houses were paid for long ago in 1960. So give those people their title deeds on Tuesday so that on Friday, they can leverage their title deeds and be able to start their own small and medium enterprises that are meant and set up to grow. Because you can't think black equals small SME. At some stage, we need to create our own black industrialists. Secondly, there's the biggest proportion of land is owned by government, by the state, by the army. So you release those pockets of land, and then you are able to provide housing for people that are currently homeless. Thirdly, it's about looking at state-owned enterprises themselves. Like I said, more than 740 telecom owned tracts of land. The fourth will be you talk to the private sector. A lot of mining houses that have 50-year lease, and yet they haven't even developed those, have already said we're willing to give it back to government. Absolutely. Before they come to the people who at 5 to midnight in 1994 were given farms for absolutely free. So there we are not even talking about land expropriation without compensation, because they got this land absolutely for free, 5 to midnight, just before we went to the votes in 1994. But also, remember, historically, even the black people that participated in the First World War of 1914 and the Second World War of 1945, if you were black and African, at best you got a bicycle if you are a supervisor. But most of them just got heavy winter jackets. But yet white male Africans got tracts of land as their way of thanking them. So the structure of the economy has always been skewed to be against African people. That's why the conversation about land today must involve all of us if we want long-lasting peace. Let me conclude by saying, my brother, you see, contrition is an ongoing process. You have to continue asking for forgiveness, and be eternally grateful for the mercy shown. We are the only country that became free without firing a bullet. Ours is a negotiated settlement. We should use those skills of negotiation to say, how do we get the 90% of the population that is squashed in 13% of the land and liberate and free them so that we get food security? Because we need to be sustainable in the short term so that we build long-term resilience over a period of time. Because this notion of resilience in Africa is much, much more than the food, energy, water nexus. Freek?
We're already running out of time, unfortunately, but let me put this one thing to you. Earlier in our discussion, you spoke about China and how security of energy was most important in that country's economic development. Do you personally believe that Eskom can eventually be delivering the energy to this country that we need? Or are they in such a desperate situation that in terms of their debt and the efficiency of running that place, we simply cannot eventually succeed?
You see, I remember when Eskom was first created, it was a truly, genuinely South African pride and joy, and it was run effectively and efficiently. By the time we inherited it, it was effective. When Dr. Ruel Khoza chaired it, it had a rating by the rating agencies higher than sovereign. All we had to do was to execute planned and preventative maintenance. We didn't. In fact, that's where state capture took root. That's where we increased the number of employees, 2010, 32,000 to 48,000 during the 9 wasted years. That's where we increased the average salary of the employees from 275,000 to 750,000, even though the percentage electricity production went down by 4 percentage points. So we did wrong decisions. So I believe it can be saved, but not in its current form, as the plans that the president has already articulated, with more than 400 billion in debt, 38 billion just by municipalities. You can see that, again, it's another own goal, because when government sits and allocates resources to each municipality, they could start by saying, you are due 300, but we're not giving you 300 because you owe Eskom 60 from National Treasury. Here's your 300 less 60. It's one financial year. This will be wiped off. But we've been talking about it for a long time. Secondly, it's about, again, just doing. You know, the first rolling blackouts were in January 2008. 14 years later, we haven't been able to fix rolling blackouts. How can we inspire confidence to ourselves? How can we say we're ready to run a country when in 14 years we can't fix the blackouts? We chose not to build the biggest coal-fired power stations in the world, in Medupi, Kusile, and then Hydro Ingula. The costs have quadrupled, but in 13 years, we're not getting our 9.6 gigawatts from Medupi so that we can get 9.6 gigawatts from Kusile. Again, why? Because we used it as an engine for looting. When Chancellor House is also a shareholder in Hitachi, so when the cost is 30 billion, you get 20% of 30 billion. But when it goes to 56, there's a perverse incentive not to stop it, because you'll get a disproportionate share, because 56 is higher than 30. And that's our fundamental mistake. I'm not even talking about political interference. When Eskom itself wanted to reduce the total wage bill to say we're not going to offer salary increases because we are in trouble, because that's what we promised our lenders who came to our rescue, and then there's political interference. I think when we can clean up that and we become absolutely wholesome and upright, our problems are actually not insurmountable. So when we can separate it into the 3 components of generation, distribution, then we are on our way towards fixing each, run independently to introduce competition. The world is moving towards renewables, independent power producer programs. When we first did the first one, of course, it was high, just less than 5 rand per kilowatt hour. By the time we went to the second, the third, and the fourth, the whole world is looking at us in awe and saying, this is beautifully executed. The policy is excellent, but ideology is what is killing us internally, because we don't even believe that we are the best in the world. The same way that we introduce public-private partnerships, PPPs, the framework from National Treasury at that time was the best in the world. But ideologically, half of cabinet don't believe in it. That's why it was just never executed. Freek?
And then finally, just briefly also, tell us, why do you believe in a social compact?
Social compact is important because that's what got us to the 75% yes vote for democracy. It's important because during the wars, international wars in KwaZulu-Natal, black on black violence, it's social compacting that allowed us to do that. It's important because when Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela, the father of democracy, inherited a technically bankrupt country, in less than 5 years, he quadrupled the GDP of this country. Where we are now, we're in a spot of both. Labor continues to demand double-digit salary increases, even though we are bankrupt. Business is not paying all the employees a living and decent wage. They are still believing that actually to look like a responsible citizen, we must be the providers of corporate social investment. SMEs don't want our charity. They want us as customers. So we must open up our value chain. When we open our value chain, that's where 40% of the economic activity is. So social compacting is necessary so that we get together in a renewed network, focused network, effective and efficient network that says, there are 10 things that are keeping us awake at night. We are really in a deep hole. We must stop digging. What are the 4 things that if we don't do, we risk the continuance and the success of this country? And we focus on those 4 things and say, we are going to do it. In developed countries and in developing economies, labor is able to say, don't give us salary increases for this year, because if you do, you will render our manufacturing to be globally uncompetitive. But because of our legacy, labor continues to want more and more. The employers, because of the mindset of apartheid, of being bosses, continue to say, I will try and cheat you for as long as I possibly can. That's not the way to run a world-class economy. That's not the way to get us into being the top 5 fastest growing economies in the world. Freek.
Professor, thank you very much. It's nice talking to you as always. All of the best and good luck in the next 3 years with your position as president of BUSA. Bye-bye.
Ek het dit baie geniet. Dit is 'n heerlike lieflike môre en ek geniet dit baie. Totsiens. En groete aan almal tuis.
Baie dankie.
Dankie vir alles.